He is, of course, the author of many books about these three counties, well, four counties, maybe straight outside the fourth, many counties, almost North Carolina, basically. Expert on the Civil War, and his wife Elizabeth Hardy, who is a former colleague of mine when our offices were right next door to each other at Mainland Community College. I miss you too. And then, of course, Ms. Isabella, who is now a student at Mainland, and a very accomplished young lady. So this family, and we're missing Nathaniel, who is a great young man. He's off doing his thing. He's doing the adulting thing.
He's adulting.
Yes, he's adulting. So anyway, I am going to let Michael introduce the fourth person he brought with him that we're so happy to has joined. And here we go.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is so good to be here in Ledger, the center of Mitchell County. Right? Y'all agree with that?
Normanville.
As Rhonda already said, my lovely wife Elizabeth and Isabella, this is our great friend Chad Bogert. He actually has people here from Mitchell County, so you may be related to him. We hang out in a lot of different time periods and historical groups. We are members of the Washington County, North Carolina Militia that's headquartered out of Sycamore Shoals. We also have a group called Friends of the 40s. And we go to several different sites. There's actually quite a few of us. We go to several different sites every year and talk usually about the war, World War II. I know I have to specify sometimes. World War II on the home front, which everybody is familiar, most folks are familiar with the Battle of Britain or D-Day or Guadalcanal or, those parts of World War II. Not a lot of folks are familiar with the war as it took place on the home front. And we kind of bring, instead of us standing up here and giving a PowerPoint program, and David, I am not against that one bit, we kind of take things in a different direction. We're historic interpreters. So not only are we here to tell you about things, but we interpret those pieces of the past as well. And we really hope that we will inspire you to learn more about this time period, or maybe you know something about what we're talking about that your grandparents passed down to you or your parents, and you can help us because we are constantly learning about that time period. We're going to talk about 4 different aspects of World War II on the home front. Every single one of those aspects has a tie-in to Western North Carolina, or the Tow River Valley, or Mitchell County, or Watauga County, or Caldwell County. Doesn't matter where, every one of those has a tie-in because they all took place here. And this is always ongoing research, what we're talking about and what we're doing, because we're always learning something new. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Elizabeth, who's going to talk a little bit about, near and dear to all of our hearts, food.
Because I'm going to talk about gardens. So, it is time to eat. So we're going to put on our apron and get ready here. All right, I just have to take my gloves off too so I can get serious. So the idea of the victory garden is one that's really, really important, not only during World War II, but also during World War I. It's actually a concept very important in both World Wars. It's a lot of the posters and things that you'll see a lot of the different kinds of ways that victory gardens were encouraged, a lot of that artwork. You'll see it kind of reused from World War I on into World War II. The concept of the victory garden is particularly important in Great Britain. And obviously Great Britain gets into the war long before the United States enters the war. And Great Britain, the idea of the victory garden is more than just a nice way to help out with the war. Britain is an island. So if they are blockaded, they starve. So it's very important for them to be able to provide their own food. So the idea of the victory garden really takes off in great acclaim in Britain. And in Britain, obviously, your garden, as what they call a garden, is the front yard. So, or the backyard, it's your yard. So the garden literally becomes a garden in in England. They really start plowing up their gardens, start plowing up their yards, and turning them into places. It really catches on in England, and then even before the United States enters the war, we really start to see a big surge and a lot of interest in the Victory Garden. And there's several reasons why that happens. Now, in this part of the world, people garden. I mean, that's just sort of part of what they do. But the idea of the Victory Garden is the idea of people who already are gardening garden more, and then people who would not normally consider themselves gardeners will be doing community gardens or gardens in their front lawns or in vacant lots or even on rooftops in urban areas. And there are many advantages, obviously, to the idea of the Victory Garden, because everything that I grow in my Victory Garden is something that all that food is being grown is consumed by my family for the most part, but that is food that we are able to create ourselves, and we don't have to use our ration books for. Everything is rationed during World War II. So that's why you'll see things like our sugar coupons that we have, and for gas, everything is rationed. So if I want to get sugar, if I want to make some jam out of some of my beautiful apples here, if I want to make apple butter or jelly, I'm going to have to use one of my sugar certificates for that. So everything is rationed, so we want to make sure that we make those rationed goods go as far as possible. And the Victory Garden really allows us to do that. It allows us to make our resources go a long way. And the concept really takes off. It's very interesting how popular the idea of the Victory Garden becomes. And hang on, I want to get my numbers here. I teach English, in case I don't know if I want to mention that. So if there are numbers involved, I have to look at them. So I have to make sure I'm looking at my numbers. There actually were about 20 million people who participated in the Victory Garden program. It's enormously popular. That's about half of the U.S. households during the war. And so about in 1944, about 40% of the produce that's being consumed by Americans was being produced in the Victory Gardens. So that's amazing. It's an incredible success story. And so the idea of having the Victory Garden really takes off, because that way we can make our rations go further. It also means that the resources that we're using be redirected to the war effort. So anything that I might normally be buying in the store, if I were normally going to be going to the market and buying a lovely cucumber, if instead I grew this cucumber, not only is the cucumber that I would have bought in the store can be sent, pickled, I guess, and sent overseas to the troops, redirected somehow to the war effort, but the gasoline that it would have taken for that cucumber to be transported and for me to go and get it, all of that resource can be redirected toward the war. So that is another reason why it is such an incredible way of supporting the war effort. And it's also something that really boosts morale. People really get into the Victory Gardens. Here, around this area, there were some great meetings. Here in Mitchell County, the county agent had community meetings. There were over 600 people that showed up to a community meeting in 1942. There were several community meetings. It wasn't just one meeting. But they showed up to these meetings to talk about scrap drives, Victory Gardens, other ways to support the war effort. Over in Yancey County, they had a competition for Victory Gardens. And if you won first place, you got a certificate. You got a defense certificate for first place for your beautiful Victory Garden. So it became this kind of neat way that people were very involved in the war effort. The thing I love about the competition over in Yancey County is all the participants were listed in the newspaper, and it was men and women, both. So it was just, anybody could participate in the Victory Gardens. All this food that's being produced, of course, also has to be preserved. And I know many of us who are gardeners, this time of year is a very busy time of year trying to produce and trying to preserve different foodstuffs that we are. I know many of you see this bowl and see these green beans and your fingers just start hurting. I have a callus right there, and its name is green, because my granny trained me well, breaking beans in this bowl a lot of times, actually. So we know this is that time of year. And canning, green beans and other things, very important. Canners during the war, between 42, 43, right around there, canners, which had originally about 66,000 canners were sold in the country. It went up to over 300,000 canners just in that short amount of time, because people are preserving what they've grown. Canners are actually rationed. Now, by 44, they're not rationed anymore. But if I want to run my canner here, I would have to get on a list, get on a waiting list, ration use my ration coupons or get a canner. And then I actually have to promise, there's this great little, and it didn't reproduce well, so, but if you want to look at it up close, I'll show it to you. It's really cute, this little card that says, I promise I will share my canner. So I'll share it with other people in my community. And also that I have, it's really funny, I love it. It says a canner is a weapon of war. Yes, it is. That's a bomb. If you don't use it correctly. And I know I do a lot of pressure canning, and I have canned many a jar of green beans, and I always pray very fervently every time I do not blow yourself up. That is always my standard kind of thing. So yes, there are a lot of people, unfortunately, who do not know how to do that. So we have some resources here that were given out by county agencies and places like that to help people can safely, not blow themselves up, and not poison people, because of course canning has to be done correctly or the food isn't safe. And you'll see I have some, these are very familiar. You'll see these all over the place, the lids that go on the jars, but the little rubber gaskets that I have up here are the thing that really, allows them to seal. And then we start getting those wonderful two-part lids. I love doing this program where people walk up and I'll say, have you ever seen these? They're the wave of the future. I just love these, those two-part lids with the ring. So the canning really catches on. After the war, it does start to drop off a little bit in popularity, but it does continue to be popular, obviously. And there are also places where people can go and get their produce canned in the community and get it canned in aluminum cans. Again, it's being rationed, so glass is often a better choice than metal, which would be rationed. So the victory gardens are just one of the things that people can do in their homes. And it becomes, again, a competition, something people really love to do in order to show their patriotism, but also to allow them to be self-sufficient and to allow them to be part of that war effort in a real and tangible sort of way.
Hello! So another aspect that was very important during the war was, believe it or not, books. During Hitler's uprising in Germany in the 1930s, many books were burned by Nazi supporters due to them being not according to their rules. And even in the early 30s, those books were actually being popularized in America because they were saying, Nazis are burning these, we should read them here. And right as the war was getting started and the peacetime draft was happening, many soldiers were going out to these training camps, which they realized were a tent. And they were training with brooms and things like that. And many of them wrote letters to their families and asked for books. Because a survey conducted in the 1930s at a military base showed that soldiers would much rather do something like reading books or writing a letter in their spare time instead of maybe doing something like going to a party or going to a movie. So in 1942, in November of that year, the first of the Books for Victory donations were started. It was held at the New York Public Library, and they gathered thousands of books using posters that were actually reused from World War I, which also had its own Books for Victory program. Books were collected, all different kinds. But one of the things when they first started this program is they didn't specify what kind of book to donate. So people were donating things like children's storybooks and cookbooks and housekeeping guides and things that soldiers wouldn't really like to read. And also, even though soldiers really enjoyed reading these in training camps, as they started being deployed overseas, they realized that you cannot carry the entire works of William Shakespeare around with you in Europe as you're traveling around fighting. So because of that and some funding reasons, the program was shut down in 1943. But in its place was started the Armed Services Editions, or ASE program. This program's goal was to provide books for the soldiers that they could easily transport. This is one of the sizes. There were two sizes of the book. This one is shaped to perfectly fit inside of a soldier's breast pocket. The other one was designed to fit in their hip pocket. These were printed in a very special format for the soldiers. They were made in 2 columns on either side, which was supposedly said to make them easier to read in poor lighting. And they were published in monthly serials. All different kinds of books were published. There was poetry, which all of mine are here. There were histories, textbooks, collections of novels, and other books, including some things like books that we today think are classics, but became so because of the Armed Services editions. One of those is The Great Gatsby, which was not at all popular in its first publication date of the 1920s, but became very popular after becoming an Armed Services edition. These ran in monthly groups, and during the war they kind of changed. When the program first started, it was about 15 to 20 titles a month. During the height of war era in 44 and 45, they were up to all the way to 35 books a month in a series. And this program was closed in 47. The reason being that there just wasn't really use for these books anymore. But a lot of soldiers found these very useful as they started to go to school after the war, because many of the textbooks that they had read had also helped them to keep up with their studies while being overseas. There's one account that I read that is absolutely beautiful, but it tells of this Marine in a hospital who's deployed in the Pacific. And he was talking about how a very special book called A Tree Grows in Brooklyn helped him get through the war. And it is an incredible letter, and it's one of those that it just is the person that you needed to write it at the right time, which is always wonderful when you find one of those. But he was talking about that book, and that book, there were only two known surviving copies of it. And there were probably somewhere around 200 to 300 copies of it originally published. Many of these books don't survive. They're not designed to stay good for a long time. They're made out of newspaper materials. But the books that still remain remind us of how these help soldiers get through the war and how important books are to soldiers.
Thank you, ladies. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to talk a little bit about civilian defense in World War II. One of the monikers of the people who lived during this time is the greatest generation. And everybody during this time got behind the war effort in some way or another. And it was really expected of everybody, of all ages, to get behind the war effort. All of our fighting age men were going overseas. And there were a lot of people here in the States that could do their part to get behind the war effort. And the Office of Civilian Defense was established shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941. And they would issue small publications, kind of like what Isabel was talking about here. Here I have the Handbook of Civilian Defense, and this tells you many ways that you can get involved in the war effort here on the home front. One thing that a lot of communities would do, and this is kind of one of the most well-known things that people associate with this time period in the home front, is scrap drives. We needed all kinds of scrap material to send to be made into things for the war. Metal especially, to build airplanes and bombers and ships and ammunition. And even the grease in your cooking skillets. The housewives would be encouraged to collect the bacon grease to be turned into, anybody have a guess what you might turn bacon grease into for the war effort? It was rendered into glycerin for bombs. So yes, there's dynamite in that grease is what one of the posters said during this time. These scrap drives were community-wide events, and Michael was just showing me research that he found just a few days ago. Here in Mitchell County, at one time there were over 300,000 pounds of scrap collected during one scrap drive, and 700,000 pounds in another scrap drive. So over 1 million pounds of scrap metal was collected right here in Mitchell County in 1942 for the war effort. It's said that a grenade could be made out of an old shovel head. So think about all that, and that's what they would tell people. You know, this old shovel head is going to make a grenade, and that's going to get people behind the war effort. They're going to be gathering all this stuff, thinking what I'm going to be collecting is going to be sent over and help our fighting boys. And they would have drives. The Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts would go through town collecting scrap and rubber, old rags, old paper, anything that they could find could be used for the war effort. There were many positions available for people to fill in civilian defense during this time. Like I said, all of our fighting age men were going overseas, so we need people to fill the roles of police and firemen. So there were auxiliary policemen, auxiliary firemen, demolition crews. Really what the Office of Civilian Defense was preparing for was emergency preparedness. We didn't know if we were going to be attacked here on the home front or not. It was very possible. Early on in the war in 1942, there was actually what they thought was a Japanese attack on Los Angeles. And it was called the Great Air Raid of 1942 in Los Angeles. And what it ended up being was a weather observation balloon that they thought was an enemy aircraft. And the coastal defense opened up on the weather balloon and nearly destroyed the town with all the chaos that ensued. 5 civilians died during the Great Air Raid of Los Angeles, 3 from automobile accidents in the chaos, and 2 from heart attacks. So those are war casualties here on the home front that could have been greatly avoided. But that's really the only time that emergency preparedness had to be kicked into effect, was during this phony raid on Los Angeles. So we were never really attacked here on the home front, but we were very, very prepared to do so. So some of the things that I have here, we have some first aid books. A lot of people were trained in first aid. We have gas masks. Civilian gas masks were issued to officers of civilian defense. And probably one of the most common civilian defense workers was the air raid warden. And that's kind of what I portray when we do our events for the Friends of the 40s, when we go to these different events. So the air raid warden, there were many of them, usually one associated for a couple of blocks in large towns and cities. And we were afraid that our defense plants would be attacked. Over in Elizabethton, where I'm from, they turned the big Bimberg plant into making parachute material. A lot of people here in Mitchell County went to work down there in the Bimberg plants. My great-grandfather was one of them. And they would ride the Tweetsee Railroad down to Elizabethton and get off at the Bimberg station. It still exists right there in Elizabethton. It's painted yellow now because they were selling scrap gold there. But they would work in the defense plant there. And I'm sure Michael's going to talk a little bit here in a minute about the mica mining that was going on in the local area, and you had to defend that in case we were attacked. The air raid wardens were responsible for planning blackouts. You didn't want any point of light shining at night because it might be a beacon for an enemy aircraft flying over to drop a bomb, and so they would have blackout drills. And you were expected to black out all your windows and not have even a pinpoint of light shining out, so it wouldn't cause a target for an enemy aircraft. And that was one of the jobs of the air raid warden, to make sure that your house was in compliance with the blackout drills. And during these drills, they would walk around to make sure that no light was shining. And if they did see light, they would write you a citation. And if you didn't get the light covered up and fixed, you were fined. And the same thing was going on in England, and of course we know that the Germans very much did attack during the Battle of Britain, but they were very much involved in blackouts as well in Great Britain. So that's just a little bit about the Office of Civilian Defense, and it was something for all Americans to get involved in, and there were millions, countless millions of Americans that got involved in the Office of Civilian Defense, and they were all volunteer. There were only just a handful of paid people in the Office of Civilian Defense, and the director of the Office of Civilian Defense was Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia of New York City, and so everybody knows who Mayor LaGuardia was. All right. Before you go this evening, do come up here, and I want you to get one of these handouts. This is a reproduction of what to do in a blackout drill. So you can take that with you and make sure your house is in compliance, or I'll I'll find you.
There was actually a blackout raid here in Mitchell County in August of 1942. It's the only one that I found to date. It may be the only one that took place during the World War II years, but I found reference to that in the Asheville newspaper, Asheville Citizen Times. So while we talk about civil defense and we talk about civilian defense and we talk about the book drives and the victory gardens, that all happened right here. Another thing that happened right here was the aircraft warning service. And a lot of people will scratch their heads and say, aircraft warning service here in Mitchell County in the Tow River Valley? What do we have to be scared of? Well, as Chad alluded to, there are a lot of strategic locations right around here in this area. The mica industry is one of them. I read an article earlier that said that by 1943, 175 mica mines had been reopened in the Tow River Valley, specifically in Mitchell County, but in the Tow River Valley area. And mica is used, I read someplace one time that there are 16 pounds of mica in every bomber, U.S. bomber. It is used in the electronics, it's used in toothpaste. I've read that they sprinkled mica, when they were building airfields in the Pacific Theater, they would roll out asphalt and they would sprinkle mica on it, roll it back up, take it to where it needed to be and unroll it. So mica is a vital part of the war industry. Quartz, Chestnut Flat Mine, which is right up the road someplace, right over there someplace. Big, huge facility, mining facility. Some of y'all may know it because of the glass that eventually became one of the telescopes out in California. Huge piece of the war industry, the quartz that was coming out of that mine, used in military electronics in the 1940s. And if we go a little further, we have the Bimberg plant in Elizabethton, which is where my grandmother worked in World War II. We have the ordnance facility in Kingsport, and then we've got that place over there in Oak Ridge that none of us know anything about, where Elizabeth's dad worked during her grandfather worked during World War II. They actually lived on base over there. So we have and that's just a fraction. I mean, we could add the dams in this area, Fontana Dam and Watauga Dam, that supplied electricity, Norris Dam that supplied electricity to the facility there at Oak Ridge. We could add all of that into that equation. Those are just the big pieces of that equation. So aircraft warning service existed right here in our area. And it's a part of that history that a lot of people don't know a whole lot of stuff about. And to be honest, I was telling Chad this the last time we did a Friends of the 40s event. I somehow have become the world expert on the aircraft warning service, and this is about it right here that we know, because I've been digging in everything. The Aircraft Warning Service was organized in May of 1941, and while it's under the governor and it's under civilian defense, it is organized by the American Legion. The American Legion post in almost every county are the people, the men usually, that are organizing the Aircraft Warning Service. And there would be a certain number of posts in every county. Avery County had 5. Buncombe County had 20 posts. How many did Mitchell have? I'm not sure yet. I only became interested in this project in the fall of 2019, and what happened in the winter of 2020? The state archives closed down. And so I'm still digging and still learning. But there were posts here, probably 4 or 5 or 6 posts in the 1940s Aircraft Warning Service. And there would be a director in the county, and it would be his job to go out in the community and say, Chad, would you like to volunteer for a full-time job in the Aircraft Warning Service? And a lot of people said yes. Men, women, children, old folks, young folks, they all volunteered to be aircraft warning spotters. And they were trained. They would have a county-wide training session where usually an Army officer or an NCO would come to your area and they would train these people in what to do. They also published literature, hints for aircraft spotters. that would be mailed and distributed to the various folks. And it told you what to report when you called in and reported things. There were directions about how to set up your observation post. I know in Avery County, the water tower at Lee's McRae College was an observation post. I have a photograph of the observation post in Crossnore that they built. I know later in the 1950s, in a different program, they built an observation post, the Boy Scouts did, on the town hall in Spruce Pine. Was there one prior to that? I don't know yet. Still working on that. But it would show you the different things, what different airplanes look like, and how to make your report. So if I'm at home at my observation post, and let me back up, they also had contests, like they did with the Victory Gardens. They had contests where we would get together and we would try and identify different types of airplanes. So we've already established what's so important here in Western North Carolina and East Tennessee. We know that they had posts starting in May of 1941. How did it work? So I have my observation post and I'm out there with my binoculars and I am looking for airplanes. And at one point, the poster man, just during the daytime after Pearl Harbor, a lot of the poster man 24/7. That probably changes in some areas. Coastal areas were probably manned 24/7. As Chad talked about the attack in Los Angeles, what do we have going on the coast of North Carolina? We've got the Germans and their U-boats sinking numerous merchant vessels in 1942. Hundreds of tons of vessels went to the bottom of the sea right off the Outer Banks. And that's where the blackout drills come into being, is because the vessels, if the coastal towns were not darkened, the vessels would be highlighted between the Germans, would be off to sea, and they could see the vessels highlighted as they went past a town, and they would sink them. Well, the Aircraft Warning Service is also out there on the coast, but they're here as well, and they are given these jobs to look for any type of airplane whatsoever. We don't have radar. A few naval vessels and bases have radar, but it's just in its infancy. I mean, and you know, it's not a widespread thing. Today, y'all can pull your magic device out of your pockets and know where just about any airplane is going at any time. So they didn't have that back then. So we, the civilians, become the radar in the United States. So I'm manning my post and I see an airplane. And I have a logbook and I jot the information down in it. And I also have this little card that I fill out. And that little card asked a certain number of questions. Question number one, number of airplanes. If I can tell, the number of airplanes. Are there few or are there many? Question number two, the type of airplanes. Does it have a single motor, a bimotor, or multi-motor? Number three, were the airplanes seen or heard? Now, living here in the mountains, you know, the sun comes up at 10 and goes down at 2 in some of the places where we live. I used to live in a place like that. Not so much now. The sun comes up about 9 and goes down about 5. But in some of those places, you know, you could hear things and not seen it. How high was the airplane? Was it very low, low, high, or very high? What is my observation post and number? Every post had a number in the state. Would it not be grand if I could find that list of all of these posts? Maybe. I'll find it one day. Direction that airplanes were going. North, south, east, west, northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest, etc. Distances of the airplane from my operation center, my post. And I would take that information on my card and I would pick up my telephone and I wouldn't say anything else but Army Flash. And the director, the operator, sorry, I'd pick up my phone, I would say Army Flash, and the operator would immediately patch me into my closest filter center. There were 3 in North Carolina, Wilmington, Charlotte, and Asheville. I assume ours is Asheville. Not found anything to say anything different. That's the closest. And I would relay all of that information on my little card to the person the operator in the filter center who picked up the phone. And in these filter centers, mostly staffed by volunteers, mostly staffed by women, there would usually be 2 or 3 Army officers in there as well, but there may be 100 women in one of these operation centers. There would be 2 rooms that had 2 big tables. And that big table would have a map of the area that handled that filter center. And the women would take these little sticks with numbers on them, and they would start to plot that airplane or groups of airplane as it went across that map. So if I called in from my post in Spruce Pine, and Chad calls in from his post in Ledger, and Dan calls in from his post in Bakersville, all of that is going in on that map, and they are plotting that airplane. So the officer in charge on that certain day would pick up the phone and he would contact the local or the closest airfield, maybe the one in Charlotte, and say, do you have any planes out? And if they said yes, we're good. It's a training mission, it's a delivery mission, supply mission, whatever. If that whoever the officer is contacting to says no, and the officer at the filter center cannot get an answer, then that officer calls the closest Air Corps base and dispatches fighter planes to go intercept. And those planes take off and they track down that mysterious airplane and figure out what it's doing. Now, have I ever found the case where an airplane got shot down in this area? No, I have not. I know of airplane crashes in this area in the 1940s, but I've not yet found one that was shot down. So that is kind of how the aircraft service worked. There are a couple of cases that I have discovered both on the West Coast, because this existed on the East Coast, the Gulf Coast, and on the West Coast. One case in the West Coast, an aircraft spotter observer observed a bomber ditching into the sea about a mile offshore. And that aircraft spotter was one of ours, bombers, and that aircraft spotter was able to pick up that phone and get them help and save 3 or 4 of the crew by getting boats out there. There was also this little episode on the West Coast where the Japanese tied incendiary bombs to small balloons and set them adrift. The idea is that when that balloon eventually ran out of gas, it would drop that incendiary bomb and would blow up and burn. And they still find those incendiary bombs today in the forest out on the West Coast, Oregon and area, that Washington State area. But there are a couple of cases of aircraft spotters, observers seeing those bombs that the Japanese launched drift over and calling that information in. The program ended in May and June of 1944. And you've got to scratch your head and say, but the D-Day invasion was not until June of 1944. I guess the powers to be realized that by 1944 we were going to win the war. Or at least we've pushed the Axis powers in the Pacific, the Japanese back, and we've retaken some of those islands. And we, in the European theater, we've conquered and freed, liberated North Africa, and I think Italy by that time, mid-44, so Sicily in that area. So the program ended in May and June of 1944. There were medals that were issued, that were awarded to some of the aircraft spotters, and then every spotter at the end of the program, got a certificate signed by the person in charge, Samuel somebody. I should have laid this on my table. I can't read what it says. Samuel Tao. Nope, Stuart W. Tao Jr., Colonel, Air Corps Commanding. So every member of the Air Corps, man, woman, and child, probably got one of those certificates. Most of them had armbands that were issued to them. They had identification cards that had a place for your photograph and described, who you were, your height, your weight, et cetera, et cetera. So there should be cards and armbands and stories about the Aircraft Warning Service and observers, and there should be stories about civilian defense and about victory gardens in the book campaign floating around Mitchell County. Most of those people who know those stories may already be gone, because the war was a long time ago. But there should be those stories out there someplace. In Avery County, I know that one armband survives from the Plumtree area. And outside of that, in the picture from Banner Elk and the picture from Cross North, that's all I got as far as putting this story together. Thankfully, the picture from Banner Elk has the names of all of the spotters standing in front of the tower. So I would love to find something like that for Mitchell County or Yancey County or even Madison County. I mean, just trying to piece this story together and tell people about one of those little aspects of World War II. And that's kind of what we are doing up here. The Friends of the 40s are doing, is trying to take these stories about civilian defense and the book campaign and the scrap drives and make sure that history is not forgotten. There are folks alive who still remember that, but they're getting fewer and fewer as time marches on. So with that, I will turn it over for questions. David, I don't know how you want to do that, but we are more than welcome for questions. I'll try and repeat the question. For any of us, yes, sir.
We've been watching the reboot of League of Their Own on TV about the women's baseball league.
Yes.
Have you guys done any exploration of that?
Well, baseball was hugely popular here in the United States, every place, and everybody, at least all the young people, played baseball.
Well, they had a women's, you know.
They did. They had the Women's League, and they had an African-American league, too. Was it officially called the Bush League? I don't remember. But there was an African-American League of Baseball. There was the Women's League of Baseball. Have y'all looked more into any of that?
I've not done a lot of that yet. McFarland has a really good line of baseball books, though. So if you're interested in the history of baseball,
We can try and help you find some more about that. We have not dug that much in. Have you dug into baseball? So,
I'm in the garden. I'm not playing baseball.
yeah, we don't have time. I'm looking for airplanes. He's got his siren going off all the time. Yes.
Do you know when the government Micah House opened in Spruce Pine?
David, do you know when was it not post-war?
It's post-war, 1946 or 7.
Yeah, it's a post-war thing. There were other mica grading houses in the area. That's how part of the Old English Inn, it was a mica facility. You have the big one in Plumtree that the Vances ran.
What I was going to say, and I don't know if this was during the war, but there was a cottage industry when all these mica mines were opened up, and the need for mica was so great. I know my grandparents had this little building like 10 or 12 by 20, and that's where they graded the mica, sheeted the mica, and then cut it into different shapes that they wanted, I guess, at the government mica house, you know. And I remember going there, and I stayed with my grandparents when I was little.
So mica was hugely popular in the United States, domestic mica, 19-teens, 1920s, and then it probably took a nosedive in 1929 with the onset of the Great Depression. And then for the 30s, it was cheaper usually to get mica from India. And the war, this is the general story, the war came along and, the Japanese submarines are out there sinking everything, and we couldn't get foreign mica anymore. And that's why the article that I found, that I think it was 175 mines reopened by like 1942 just in Mitchell County. It says just in Mitchell County. I kind of think it was the mica belt that stretches from Avery into Yancey, but just in Mitchell County. So everybody had a mica mine. I mean, every farmer, after he got done farming, not every farmer, most farmers when they got done farming would go out and have a little patch of mica they would harvest and take to the government and sell. There are probably brokers here, government brokers buying that in the war years.
So the depot started when Sam Phillips got it declared a strategic mineral.
Mm-hmm.
And that kept the mica industry going into the 50s. And then,
Yeah.
of course, it tails back down.
Yep. Big here in the 50s and 60s. And then David has a picture in his Spruce Pine book of the observation tower the Boy Scouts built on top of the town hall building.
Yep.
And be great to know if there were other observation posts in the county at that point. But this is an era of history we don't talk a whole lot about. So we're all still learning. But if you know me, you know that's my song and dance. So many parts of history we don't know anything about. Isn't that right, Mitzi? Yeah. Mitzi knows that's my song and dance. So all the things we don't know. Other thoughts or questions for any of us about civilian defense or books or...
Something you might note that our region and the Torpedo Junction at Cape Hatteras is this region actually assisted the Germans. There was a radio station on Mount Mitchell, W41MM was its call sign. This is an early FM station, and it would broadcast with a very high power, and the Germans could pick it up in the ocean, and that's how they knew they were off Cape Hatteras. So W41MM actually helped them figure out where to be, and it 300 miles inland.
We also have prisoner of war camps in North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
And we had them during World War I and we had them in World War II, and that's another aspect of history we don't talk a whole lot about. But there were both Germans and Italian prisoners at these camps, and they would usually loan out the prisoners. So if your farm needed an extra hand when it was time to cut your wheat or your onions or dig your potatoes, you could go hire out some Italians. Your Italians and your regular German army did that. There was a camp someplace, maybe at Camp Butner near Raleigh, where they had some of the Waffen SS folks, and they didn't rent those folks out because they were pretty hardcore ideologues.
I believe it was Hot Springs where...
Well, that's a little different case. Those, if I understand right, Hot Springs they were Germans already here in the United States when the war started. And had they put them on a ship and sent them, they probably would have been sunk by one of the German submarines. So they built that camp over there, and I have to read my own book, Dan, but I think there were about 3,000 Germans, I'm serious, I have to read my own book, over there at that camp for a number of months. And I mean, they had a carousel they built over there and a church and all this other stuff that they built. And they were over there for a certain number of months, and then they got shipped to another facility, I think in Alabama. But I'll have to read my own book. Yes, sir?
Can you talk a little bit about the rationing that went on during the war?
I can for sure. Everything is rationing. We do have some great ration books up here if anybody wants to look at them. They aren't, they're just sort of partial because a lot of them were used. They use different things. So everything's rationed. And it's interesting that the rationing is very specific for how people are going to be using the resources. So that's another thing that's, people are assigned to jobs like being, and I don't know, the air raid warden, I wouldn't be really happy with him setting that thing off. But the ration board could also be a little, because those are the people who determine how much sugar you get. And a lot of that has to do with your situation. So if you have a war job and you have to drive to that job, you get more ration coupons for things like tires and gas and oil because your driving is very important. If you want to buy a car, it's easier for you to do that because you have this war job that requires you to have that transportation. So if you have children, you have different kinds of things on your ration coupon. Adult men who are working in war, they get more food, so those kinds of things. So that's, certain things are rationed. Canned goods are rationed. But things that you produce yourself, of course, that's not rationed. Now, one thing that I found was really interesting is, of course, sugar is rationed. And if I'm growing lots of apples or berries, one of the things that people were really encouraged to grow in their victory gardens was fruit. Fruit was really, really strongly pushed as something to be grown in a victory garden. And you think about all the blueberries that grow so well around here, blackberries. I remember the first time I went someplace and people asked me, because I commented on how beautiful the blackberries were at this program I went to. They were on the what we call the Chattahoochee board they had out there. I think that's not what it's called, but that's what I call it. But they had these big, beautiful. I'm sorry. French is Isabella's second language, not mine. But they had these big, beautiful blackberries. They were about the size of your thumb. And I said something about how beautiful the blackberries were. And they said, yeah, they were expensive. And I said, oh. And they asked me how much blackberries cost here in North Carolina. I said, I don't know. I've never paid for a blackberry day in my life. And so they asked if I didn't like them. I'm like, no, I love blackberries. I eat them all the time. But I never paid for one. They just grow everywhere. So if you want to make jam, something like that, obviously you're going to need a lot of sugar. And these sugar certificates, and as I said, I have several copies of these, in order to be able to get extra rations. So if you're getting 5 pounds of sugar, which is a pretty standard ration, that only goes so far. And so that's when things like one of my other loves, which is beekeeping, really becomes more interesting to people as well, because you can use honey, obviously, to supplement your sugar. People making sorghum, that kind of thing, which is very popular. But if you can prove that you are growing in your victory garden a sufficient amount of fruit that you need the sugar to help with the preservation of that, then you can get up to 20 pounds extra. So, yeah, that's a big bonus there. So definitely different, so it's very much a gradation. It's very specific. But as the war begins to wind down, the rationing does too. So as it looks like we are things are not going to be as, so the canners stopped being rationed about 44, and so it was much easier to get one later on. So I don't know if that answered your question or not, but everything is rationed. Shoes, tires. Yeah.
Yeah, there were, as you say, there are different categories of
Yes.
the gasoline rationing.
Mm-hmm.
And those that got unlimited category, mailmen,
Yep.
ministers, and politicians.
And politicians, isn't that funny? That's right. I wondered about this when I got, because there were a lot of the fuel coupons left. So I always wondered, why they didn't need all of those from this particular collection. And people traded. Everybody was very patriotic, but people were also, hey, nobody in my family smokes. What are we going to do with these cigarette, rations? Or if you have children and you think, well, these people over here have kids and they need more sugar for birthday cake. So a lot of times people would like share their ration coupons for special occasions and that kind of thing. So.
Where would they go to get the ration coupons?
That is a very good question, because that changes in different communities. And you'll see some of the ones I have up here, they're different ones, and they're different issues. So like this is War Ration Book 2. So they issue them at different times. And they have to be signed, and there's a rationing board, and there's an office. There are all these officials, all these people that are in charge of a lot of these things. And like I said, I kind of wonder, I have not seen I would like to see more accounts about how people felt about the people who were in charge of that. But yes, they did have to be stamped, and people in the store, even if there were items in the store. So, I know about you, but I'm really picky about peanut butter, and it has not been a peanut butter time for me. I'm very unhappy with the peanut butter state of the world. But even if I could find the peanut butter that I want, I have to still have my ration coupon to get. So I can't just get it just because the store has it. So when they do have my peanut butter, I can't go and get 17 jars. So, but somebody did. That's why there's no peanut butter at the store. Somebody has 17 jars of my peanut butter. This morning at my store. Yes, I was there this morning looking for peanut butter. But you still have to have the coupon to go with it. So it's both supply and actually being able to buy it. So they don't just put up a sign that says you only get to buy 2 packages of toilet paper. They really truly make you give the stamp.
There's probably several businessmen that started out during the war, like dealing with used tires, and made a lot of money. I don't know when Brad Reagan started his business, but I know there's a guy in Swannanoa who was Dillingham, and that's how they said he got his start, but somehow he would corner the market on what tires were available and resell them,
I still have one of my first baby shoes that my mother saved with God.
Any other thoughts or questions?
We have this beautiful star. Thank you for bringing, this is
Yep.
not part of our collection. We have this beautiful blue star. We have this beautiful blue star being shared, thank you, from a family collection. That's not part of ours, so thank you for letting us use it tonight.
But if folks want to walk up and check out some of this stuff, you're more than welcome to. Probably 85 or 90% of it is original to the time period. There are a few things that are not original, but most of it is.
Those vegetables are not from 1943.
No, they came out of our garden a couple hours ago.
That tree that those apples came from is probably from 1943.
It probably is. So, Rhonda, Dan, I guess we're done.
Thank you.